The morning sun reflected off the calm waters of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood in his office in Japan, waiting for confirmation. When the telegram arrived, his hands trembled slightly as he read it. The attack was successful. 8 American battleships damaged or destroyed. Nearly 200 aircraft eliminated. The American Pacific Fleet was crippled. Across Tokyo, Japanese naval officers celebrated in their war rooms. Admiral Tanaka raised his glass of sake with his fellow commanders. They had done the impossible. In one swift strike, they had bought the Empire of Japan precious time to secure the Pacific. The Americans would need years to recover from such a devastating blow. Intelligence Officer Nakamura sat quietly in the corner of the celebration, reviewing reports. According to their information, America now had only 3 aircraft carriers left in the Pacific Ocean: the Lexington, Saratoga, and Enterprise. Just 3 ships to protect an entire ocean. Meanwhile, Japan had 10 carriers, all with experienced pilots who had trained for years. The math seemed simple and favorable, but Yamamoto did not celebrate. He returned to his quarters and stared at a map of the Pacific. He had lived in America. He had seen their factories, their cities, their endless resources. He once told his colleagues that he could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, he had no confidence in victory. His fellow admirals laughed at his caution. They believed Japanese spirit and training would overcome American numbers. The months after Pearl Harbor proved Japan's dominance. Their carriers struck across the Pacific and into the Indian Ocean. They sank the British ships Prince of Wales and Repulse. They attacked Darwin in Australia. They raided Ceylon. Everywhere the Japanese carriers went, they won. Their pilots were the best in the world, veterans with thousands of hours of flight time. The Americans seemed helpless to stop them. Admiral Tanaka walked through the corridors of naval headquarters with pride. He told anyone who would listen that Japan had achieved naval supremacy. The Americans were retreating everywhere. Their battleship fleet was destroyed. Their carriers were hiding. Victory was certain. Officer Nakamura continued his work tracking American movements. He noticed something in the reports that troubled him. The Americans were not building battleships to replace the ones they lost. Instead, every intelligence report mentioned carriers. New carriers under construction. Many of them. He marked each one on his map with a small flag. The flags began to multiply. In April 1942, American bombers appeared over Tokyo. They came from the carrier Hornet, a ship that was supposed to be far away. The raid caused little damage, but the psychological impact was enormous. If American carriers could reach Tokyo, nowhere in Japan was safe. Yamamoto knew the Americans would seek revenge for Pearl Harbor. He decided to lure their remaining carriers into a trap. The target was Midway Island, a small piece of land in the middle of the Pacific. Yamamoto assembled the largest carrier fleet ever seen. 4 fleet carriers with over 200 aircraft. Cruisers, battleships, and destroyers by the dozens. The American carriers would come to defend Midway, and Japan would destroy them. The war would be over. Officer Nakamura prepared the intelligence reports for the Midway operation. On paper, Japan had overwhelming superiority. 4 carriers against perhaps 3 American carriers. Experienced pilots against inexperienced ones. Modern aircraft against older models. Every advantage belonged to Japan. Yet Nakamura felt uneasy. His latest reports showed American shipyards working at incredible speed. Something large was happening in America, but he could not yet see the full picture. June 4th, 1942 began as a routine morning for the Japanese carrier fleet near Midway. Planes launched to attack the island. Then scouts reported American carriers nearby. Admiral Nagamo, commanding the carrier fleet, faced a terrible decision. His planes were armed with bombs for attacking the island. He needed to rearm them with torpedoes for attacking ships. While his crews worked frantically below deck, American dive bombers appeared in the sky. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers became floating infernos. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the pride of the fleet, were destroyed. A fourth carrier, Hiryu, launched a counterstrike that damaged the American carrier Yorktown. But American planes found Hiryu and set her ablaze too. By the end of the day, all four Japanese carriers were gone. Over 300 aircraft lost. Hundreds of experienced pilots dead. The news reached Tokyo like an earthquake. Admiral Tanaka sat in stunned silence. For carriers lost in a single day, it was impossible to believe. These were the same carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, that had dominated the Pacific for 6 months. Now they rested at the bottom of the ocean near a tiny island most Japanese had never heard of. Yamamoto received the reports aboard his battleship, far behind the carrier fleet. He had suspected the Americans might be waiting. Their intelligence was better than Japan expected, but the scale of the defeat shocked even him. Japan had trained those pilots for a decade. Those carriers took years to build. They could not be replaced quickly. Officer Nakamura returned to his office after the Midway disaster. He pulled out his files on American shipyards. The reports were clear now. America was not just building a few carriers to replace losses. They were building dozens. He saw photographs taken by Japanese agents showing shipyards in Newport News, Philadelphia, and other cities. Multiple carrier hulls under construction at the same time. He made calculations on paper. Japan's largest shipyard could build one fleet carrier at a time. It took nearly 2 years from start to finish. America had multiple shipyards, each building several carriers simultaneously. The numbers made him feel cold inside. Admiral Tanaka finally visited Nakamura's office. The defeat at Midway had changed him. His pride was gone, replaced by grim determination. Nakamura showed him the photographs and calculations. Tanaka studied them for a long time. Then he said something that surprised Nakamura. "We can still win. Our pilots are better trained. Our tactics are superior. Quality will defeat quantity." Nakamura wanted to believe him, but the numbers on his desk told a different story. A story that was only beginning to unfold. The intelligence room in Tokyo Naval Headquarters felt smaller each day. Officer Nakamura had covered an entire wall with photographs and charts. Each photograph showed an American shipyard. Each chart tracked construction progress of American carriers. The wall had become a shrine to his obsession, and what he saw there terrified him. December 1942 arrived with cold winds and colder news. Reports confirmed that America had commissioned a new fleet carrier named USS Essex. Nakamura marked it on his board with a red pen. This was not a replacement for a lost carrier. This was something entirely new. A class of carrier built from a completely new design. Fast, large, and built specifically for mass production. Admiral Tanaka stood before Nakamura's wall of intelligence. He counted the pins marking American carriers under construction. 7, 8, 9. He stopped counting. His face remained calm, but Nakamura saw his hands clench into fists. Japan had started the war with 10 carriers. They now had 6 operational after Midway. America started with 7 carriers in the Pacific. The board showed they would soon have more than 20. "Your numbers must be wrong," Tanaka said quietly. "No nation can build carriers this fast." Nakamura handed him a folder. Inside were reconnaissance photographs taken by Japanese submarines near American ports. The images showed massive shipyards working day and night. Bright lights illuminated the construction sites even after sunset. Thousands of workers moved like ants around enormous steel structures. Each structure was a carrier taking shape. "They work in 3 shifts, Nakamura explained. "The shipyards never stop. Not for holidays. Not for weekends. Never." Japan's main naval shipyard at Kure worked hard too, but they could only build 1 fleet carrier at a time. Their newest carrier, Taiho, was already under construction. It would be the most advanced carrier ever built, with an armored flight deck and improved defenses. But it would take until 1944 to complete. 2 years for 1 carrier. Meanwhile, American shipyards were launching a new Essex-class carrier every 6 to 8 weeks. Nakamura had done the calculation so many times he had memorized it. If America maintained this pace, they would have 30 fleet carriers before the war ended. Japan would be fortunate to have 10. The situation for pilots was even worse. Lieutenant Saito returned from operations in the Solomon Islands with dark circles under his eyes. He had flown combat missions for 8 months straight. His squadron started with 20 pilots. 12 were dead. 5 were wounded. Only 3 original pilots remained, including himself. When he asked about replacements, his commander had no good answer. The problem was simple and deadly. Before the war, Japan trained pilots for years. They needed thousands of flight hours to be considered ready for combat. This created superb pilots, but very few of them. America took a different approach. They trained pilots for months, not years. The training was shorter, but they produced hundreds of new pilots every month. Team Midway, Japan lost many of their best pilots. These men were irreplaceable. They had 10 years of experience. They knew every trick, every tactic. Now, they were gone, and Japan could not create new ones fast enough. The training program required too much time and fuel. Fuel that Japan desperately needed for combat operations. America's pilot training schools stretched across their continent. They had perfect weather in California, Texas, and Florida. They had unlimited fuel from Texas oil fields. They had safe skies where student pilots could practice without fear of attack. By late 1942, American training programs were producing over 1,000 new pilots every month. Lieutenant Saito met with some of these new American pilots after they were captured. He was shocked by how young they were. Many had less than 300 hours of flight time. By Japanese standards, they were not even qualified yet. But America sent them to carriers anyway because they had so many carriers to fill. Numbers were replacing quality. In January 1943, Officer Nakamura received a report that made his blood run cold. 3 more Essex-class carriers had been commissioned in a single month. USS Yorktown, named after the carrier lost at Midway. USS Intrepid. USS Hornet, also named after a lost carrier. 3 fleet carriers in 1 month. Japan would take 6 years to build 3 fleet carriers that he walked to Admiral Yamamoto's office with the report. Yamamoto had become increasingly isolated from other admirals. Many blamed him for the Midway defeat. But Yamamoto understood the strategic situation better than anyone else. He looked at Nakamura's report without surprise. "I warned them before Pearl Harbor," Yamamoto said softly. "I told them we would awaken a sleeping giant. Now the giant is awake and building ships faster than we can sink them." Yamamoto showed Nakamura his own calculations. American industrial capacity was 10 times larger than Japan's. Their steel production was 12 times greater. Their oil production was hundreds of times larger. The mathematics of war were simple. Japan could not win a long war against such overwhelming resources. "Then why do we continue fighting?" Nakamura asked. Yamamoto looked out his window at Tokyo. "Because the decision to stop is not mine to make. I can only fight the best war possible with the forces I have." By spring 1943, the reality became impossible to ignore. American carriers appeared everywhere. They struck Japanese bases in the Central Pacific. They supported marine landings in the Solomon Islands. They raided targets that were supposed to be safe. Every month brought reports of new American carriers joining the fleet. Lieutenant Saito flew a mission against an American task force near the Solomon Islands. He expected to see 1 or 2 carriers. Instead, he counted 5. 5 carriers operating together, protected by dozens of other ships. His small attack group was wiped out by American fighters. He barely escaped with his life. In the intelligence room, Nakamura added new pins to his board. USS Essex, USS Yorktown, USS Intrepid, USS Lexington, another ship named after a carrier lost earlier, USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp. The pins covered the board like a disease, spreading across the map. Each pin represented a carrier that could launch over 100 aircraft. Each pin represented a weapon Japan could not match. Admiral Tanaka stopped by one evening. He no longer argued about quality versus quantity. The reports from combat zones told the truth. American pilots were getting better with experience. Japanese pilots were becoming exhausted without replacement. American carriers operated in groups of 4 or 5. Japanese carriers operated alone or in pairs because they had so few left. How many will they have by year's end? Tanaka asked. Nakamura checked his calculations. If they maintain current production rates, 15 to 17 fleet carriers. And us, 7. Perhaps 8 if Taiho finishes early. Tanaka left without another word. The numbers spoke for themselves. Every 6 weeks, another Essex-class carrier arrived in the Pacific. Every 6 weeks, Japan fell further behind. The war was becoming a race Japan could not win. The war room in Tokyo looked like a battlefield of paper. Maps covered every table. Red pins marked Japanese positions. Blue pins marked American forces. Officer Nakamura stood before the largest map showing the entire Pacific Ocean. The blue pins were spreading like flood water. Behind each blue pin was at least one American carrier. Sometimes 2. Sometimes 5. Summer 1943 brought news that changed everything. American forces landed on New Georgia Island in the Solomons. They were supported by 3 carrier groups. Not 3 carriers. 3 groups of carriers. Over 10 carriers in one operation. Admiral Tanaka stared at the report with disbelief. Japan had 8 carriers total in their entire navy. America was using 10 just to support one landing operation. Lieutenant Saito had barely slept in 3 weeks. His squadron was based in Rabaul, trying to defend against constant American attacks. Every day brought new raids. American planes came in waves. When one wave was beaten back, another arrived. The American carriers took turns launching attacks. They had so many carriers they could afford to rotate them for rest, while others continued fighting. Japanese pilots had no such luxury. Saito flew missions every day. His squadron mates looked like ghosts, exhausted beyond measure. When a pilot was killed, no replacement arrived. The squadron shrank from 20 planes to 15, then to 10. Saito knew they were being ground down by an enemy with unlimited resources. The new American pilots worried Saito most. 6 months ago, they were easy to defeat. They made mistakes and flew in predictable patterns. Now, they were dangerous. They learned quickly from experience. Their tactics improved with each battle. Meanwhile, Japan's best pilots were dead. The replacements sent from training schools had less than half the flight hours of American pilots. Japan was losing the quality advantage that Admiral Tanaka had counted on. Officer Nakamura received intelligence reports from agents in America. What they described seemed impossible. The shipyards had become giant factories. They built carriers using assembly line methods, the same way factories built cars. Sections of carriers were built separately, then joined together like puzzle pieces. This method was faster than traditional shipbuilding. Much faster that Nakamura's wall showed 23 Essex-class carriers now under construction or completed. 23. And that did not include light carriers or escort carriers. America was building those too by the dozens. His calculations showed Essex carriers were being commissioned at a rate of 1 every 6 weeks. Like clockwork. Predictable. Unstoppable. Japan's strategy had shifted completely. No longer did they think about attacking. Now they thought only about defending. But defending what? American carriers could strike anywhere. They had enough carriers to be in multiple places at once. While some attacked one island, others raided a different target hundreds of miles away. Japan's defenses were stretched too thin to stop them all. In November 1943, American forces attacked Tarawa and Macon in the Gilbert Islands. 12 carriers supported the invasion. 12. Lieutenant Saito flew from a nearby base to help defend. He arrived to see the sky filled with American planes. Over 700 aircraft from the carriers. His small group of 20 fighters was overwhelmed in minutes. He was one of 5 pilots who survived to return home. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay showed the new reality clearly. American carriers provided air cover so complete that Japanese planes could not get close to their ships. American fighters swarmed over any Japanese aircraft that appeared. The term used by American pilots spread even to Japanese intelligence reports. They called it air superiority. When you had enough carriers, you owned the sky. By early 1944, Officer Nakamura stopped updating his wall daily. The blue pins multiplied too fast. Every week brought news of another Essex carrier joining the fleet. USS Franklin, USS Ticonderoga, USS Randolph, USS Hancock, USS Bennington. The names blurred together. Each name represented 100 aircraft. Each name represented a ship Japan could not sink faster than America built them. Admiral Yamamoto died in April 1943 when American fighters ambushed his plane. The Americans intercepted Japanese communications and knew exactly where he would be. They sent fighters from land bases to shoot him down. With Yamamoto gone, the remaining admirals faced the impossible situation he had predicted. They were running out of options that Japan's oil situation made everything worse. Their carriers needed fuel oil. Their planes needed aviation gasoline. Their supply lines from the Dutch East Indies oil fields were being cut by American submarines and carriers. Even when Japan had carriers available, they often lacked fuel to operate them at full capacity. America had unlimited oil from Texas and California. Their carriers never sat idle due to fuel shortages. Lieutenant Saito returned to Japan in December 1943 for his first leave in over a year. He barely recognized his country. Food was rationed. Everyone looked tired. The government propaganda spoke of victories, but Saito had seen the truth. Japan was losing. Slowly, steadily, inevitably losing. The American carriers were destroying them one island at a time, that he met with Officer Nakamura one evening. They drank sake together and spoke honestly, something that was dangerous in military circles. Nakamura showed him the calculations. The numbers were brutal. By mid-1944, America would have over 20 Essex-class fleet carriers. Japan would have perhaps 9 carriers total, including smaller ones. The ratio was more than 2-to-1 in fleet carriers alone, including light carriers and escort carriers. America would have over 50 carriers of all types. Can we win? Saito asked. Nakamura refilled their cups. We lost when we attacked Pearl Harbor. We just did not know it yet. Yamamoto knew. He tried to tell them. They did not listen. Admiral Tanaka no longer made confident predictions. He spent his time planning desperate strategies. His latest plan involved using carriers as bait to draw American carriers into range of land-based aircraft. The plan required sacrificing Japanese carriers to sink American ones. Even if successful, America would replace their lost carriers within months. Japan would not. The spring of 1944 approached with a sense of doom in Tokyo. Intelligence reported that America now had 17 Essex-class carriers operational. More were completing sea trials. The 6-week production cycle continued without pause. Japanese shipyards had completed just 2 new carriers since Midway, almost 2 years ago. The mathematics of the war had become a nightmare. For every carrier Japan built, America built 12. Officer Nakamura looked at his wall one last time before the major battle he knew was coming. The blue pins covered the map like stars in the sky. Each one represented American power. Each one represented another nail in Japan's coffin. The Essex carriers had arrived every 6 weeks, just as the intelligence predicted. And now Japan would face the consequences of that relentless production. The morning of June 19th, 1944 began with tension thick enough to cut. Admiral Ozawa stood on the bridge of Carrier Taiho, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. Around him sailed 8 more Japanese carriers. This was nearly every operational carrier Japan had left. 9 carriers carrying over 400 aircraft. It was Japan's last chance to stop the American advance toward the Mariana Islands. The plan seemed sound on paper. Japanese carriers would launch their planes from long range. The aircraft would attack the American fleet, then land at bases on Guam and Saipan to refuel. After refueling, they would attack again on the return flight. Meanwhile, land-based aircraft from the Marianas would add their strength to the assault. Together, they would overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers of aircraft. But Admiral Ozawa did not know everything. American submarines lurked beneath the waves. They had been tracking his fleet for days. At dawn, submarine USS Albacore fired 6 torpedoes at Taiho. One struck the carrier's hull. The damage seemed minor at first. Taiho continued operations, but fuel vapors were leaking into the ship. The carrier was slowly becoming a floating bomb. Lieutenant Saito prepared for battle aboard carrier Zuikaku. He was one of the few veteran pilots remaining in the entire fleet. Most pilots around him were teenagers with barely 100 hours of flight time. They had trained for only a few months. There was no time for more training. No fuel for practice flights. These boys were being sent into battle against experienced American pilots flying superior aircraft. Saito knew most of them would not survive the day. The American fleet that awaited them was beyond anything Japan had faced before. 15 carriers. 7 of them were Essex-class fleet carriers. USS Hornet, USS Yorktown, USS Bunker Hill, USS Wasp, USS Essex, USS Lexington, USS Enterprise. Each one carried over 100 aircraft. The Americans had so many carriers, they organized them into 4 separate task groups. Each task group had more carriers than most navies possessed in their entire fleet. T-0830 hours. The first wave of Japanese aircraft launched. Over 200 planes climbed into the sky. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. From his cockpit, Saito could see the massive formation. It looked impressive. It looked powerful. But Saito felt cold dread in his stomach. He had fought Americans before. He knew what was coming. The Americans detected the Japanese aircraft while they were still 150 miles away. Their radar technology had improved dramatically since the war began. The detection gave them time to prepare. American carriers launched over 450 fighters into the air. Grumman F-6F Hellcats, the best carrier fighter in the world. Then the American carriers turned into the wind and launched every remaining fighter they had. Over 300 more Hellcats rose to meet the Japanese attack. The slaughter began while the Japanese planes were still 60 miles from the American fleet. American fighters dove into the Japanese formation like sharks into a school of fish. The new Japanese pilots panicked. They broke formation. They made basic mistakes. American pilots shot them down with brutal efficiency. Saito watched in horror as young pilots died around him. Planes fell from the sky, trailing smoke and fire. Some exploded in midair. Others spiraled into the ocean below. Saito was one of only a handful of pilots who reached the American fleet. What he saw there made him understand how completely Japan had lost this war. The sky was filled with American fighters. Hundreds of them. They circled above their carriers in layers. Any Japanese plane that got through one layer faced another, and another. The defenses were impossible to penetrate. Of the 200 aircraft in the first wave, fewer than 30 survived. Most never even saw an American carrier. They were shot down by fighters long before reaching their targets. A few bombs and 1 torpedo hit American ships, causing minor damage. Nothing that would stop a carrier from operating. The cost was catastrophic. Over 170 Japanese aircraft lost. Most of the pilots were dead. 3 more waves followed throughout the day. Each wave was destroyed the same way. American radar detected them from long range. American fighters swarmed over them. The Japanese pilots, poorly trained and in inferior aircraft, stood no chance. American pilots later described it as shooting turkeys. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. By the end of the day, Japan had lost over 600 aircraft and 3 carriers. Taiho exploded from the accumulated fuel vapors. 1 torpedo from a submarine had caused the carrier to destroy itself. Carrier Shokaku was hit by 4 torpedoes from submarine USS Kavala and sank. Carrier Hyo was sunk by aircraft. Japan's carrier force was devastated. American losses were 123 aircraft and no carriers damaged seriously. The kill ratio was almost 5-to-1 in aircraft. The carrier loss ratio was 3-to-0. It was not a battle. It was an execution. Lieutenant Saito survived. His skill and experience saved him where luck saved few others. He landed on Guam with almost no fuel. His aircraft was riddled with bullet holes. He sat in the cockpit for a long time after landing, unable to move. All around him, Japanese personnel were counting the returning aircraft. So few came back. So many empty sky. That night, Saito learned the full scope of the disaster. Over 600 aircraft lost. 3 carriers sunk. Japan's naval aviation was effectively destroyed. The Americans could replace 600 aircraft in 2 months. Japan would need 2 years. The Americans had lost no carriers. They still had 15 operating in the Philippine Sea. More Essex carriers were completing their trials back in America. USS Ticonderoga, USS Randolph, USS Langley. The production continued without pause. A week later, Saito returned to Japan on a destroyer. His carrier Zuikaku had survived, but had no aircraft left to carry. He walked through Tokyo and saw the truth in people's faces. They knew the government could not hide the losses anymore. Japan was losing the war. Officer Nakamura met him at naval headquarters. The intelligence room was quiet now. The wall of photographs and charts had been taken down. There was no point tracking American carrier production anymore. The numbers were overwhelming. America had 22 Essex-class carriers now operational or in final trials. Japan had 6 carriers left with almost no aircraft or trained pilots to fly from them. They used 15 carriers in one battle, Nakamura said quietly. 15. And they have 7 more in reserve back in Pearl Harbor. They can afford to leave carriers idle because they have so many. Saito understood the implication. America's production was so vast that carriers were becoming common weapons. They could use multiple carriers for simple operations. They could rotate carriers for maintenance and rest while others continued fighting. Japan had to commit every carrier to every major operation because they had so few left. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot marked the end of Japanese carrier aviation. The ships survived, but they had no aircraft. The pilots were dead. The training program had collapsed. Japan would never again field a competent carrier force. And every 6 weeks, another Essex carrier arrived in the Pacific to join the American fleet. October 1944 brought the final desperate gamble. The Philippines were about to fall. If America captured the Philippines, they would cut Japan off from oil supplies in the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, the Japanese fleet could not operate. The entire war machine would grind to a halt. Admiral Toyota devised a complex plan using every remaining ship Japan possessed. It was called Operation Shogo, Victory Operation, but everyone knew it was really a last stand. The plan required Japan's 4 remaining carriers to sail north of the Philippines as bait. They would lure American carriers away from the landing beaches. While the Americans chased the carriers, Japanese battleships would attack the vulnerable troop transports. It was a suicide mission for the carriers, but Japan was out of options. Officer Nakamura stood in the operations room as the plan was explained. He wanted to laugh at the absurdity, but the situation was too tragic. Japan's mighty carriers, the ships that had struck Pearl Harbor and dominated the Pacific in 1942, were now reduced to decoys. They had no aircraft to fly from their decks. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot had destroyed Japanese naval aviation. These carriers would sail north with empty decks, hoping Americans would chase them while their aircraft carriers were the real threat elsewhere. The 4 carriers assigned to this suicide mission were Zuikaku, Chitose, and Chiyoda. Zuikaku was the last survivor of the Pearl Harbor attack force. She had fought in every major battle. Now she would sail to her death carrying only a handful of aircraft, mostly trainers and obsolete models. It was a humiliating end for such a proud ship. Lieutenant Saito was not aboard the carriers. There was no reason for experienced pilots to die in a suicide mission. Instead, he was assigned to a new program, a program that made him sick to his stomach. Kamikaze. The word meant divine wind. Young pilots would deliberately crash their planes into American ships. When you could not defeat the enemy with skill, you used desperation. Sato's job was to train these kamikaze pilots. Boys, really. Most were 18 or 19 years old. They had perhaps 40 hours of flight time, just enough to take off, fly straight, and crash into a ship. They did not need to learn combat tactics or how to land. They only needed to reach their target and die. Saito felt like he was training children for execution. That on October 24th, the suicide carrier force sailed north. American search planes spotted them quickly. Admiral Halsey, commanding Task Force 38, took the bait. He turned his entire carrier force north to pursue the Japanese carriers. 16 American carriers. 9 of them were Essex-class fleet carriers. They steamed north at high speed, eager to destroy the remaining Japanese carriers. The American pilots who attacked the Japanese carriers on October 25 found targets that barely fought back. The carriers had so few aircraft they could not defend themselves effectively. American dive bombers and torpedo bombers attacked in waves. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk within hours. Zuikaku, the last Pearl Harbor veteran, capsized and sank with her battle flags still flying. Her captain and crew saluted as the ship went under. It was the end of an era, but the sacrifice achieved nothing. While Halsey chased the carriers north, Japanese battleships did attack the American landing force. However, escort carriers and destroyers fought back with such determination that the battleships retreated. Japan lost the 4 carriers and gained nothing. The Philippines fell to American control. The oil supply was cut. Japan's navy was finished as a fighting force. Officer Nakamura sat alone in the intelligence room after the battle. He had tracked American carrier production for 3 years. His predictions had been accurate. America had built exactly what he calculated they would build. 24 Essex-class fleet carriers were now operational. 24. In the same time period, Japan had completed 2 new carriers. The production ratio was 12-1. No navy in history could survive such a disadvantage that he pulled out his oldest charts from December 1941. When the war began, Japan had 10 carriers to America's 7 in the Pacific. A favorable ratio. Admiral Tanaka had been confident then. He believed Japanese quality would overcome American quantity. Now Tanaka was retired in disgrace. Yamamoto was dead. The carriers were sunk, and Essex-class carriers still arrived every 6 weeks in the Pacific. Lieutenant Saito watched his kamikaze students practice. They flew their planes in simple patterns. Straight lines, gentle turns, nothing complex. They would not live long enough to need advanced skills. Some of them smiled and talked about honor. Others looked terrified. All of them were going to die. One young pilot, barely 17 years old, asked Saito a question. Will my attack make a difference? Will it help Japan win? Saito wanted to lie. He wanted to give the boy comfort. But he was tired of lies. No, he said quietly. It will not make a difference. America has too many ships. Even if you sink 1 carrier, they have 20 more. They build them faster than we can sink them. The boy looked confused. Then why am I doing this? Saito had no good answer. The kamikaze attacks would continue until the war ended. Thousands of young men would die crashing into American ships. They would sink some ships, damage others, but they could not change the outcome. America's industrial production had already decided the war. WWII early 1945, American carriers operated near Japan itself. They launched strikes against Tokyo and other cities. The same carriers that had once seemed impossible to build now sailed unopposed in Japanese waters. Essex-class carriers USS Hornet, USS Wasp, USS Bennington, USS Shangri-La, and others formed task forces so powerful that Japan could not challenge them. Former Admiral Tanaka visited Yamamoto's shrine in April 1945. He brought a photograph he had obtained from a neutral source. It showed Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The harbor was filled with American carriers. Essex-class carriers lined up at anchor, so many they could barely fit. The photograph included a count. 32 fleet carriers. 32. America had built more than 3 times the number of fleet carriers Japan possessed at the war's peak. Tanaka remembered Yamamoto's words from before Pearl Harbor. I can run wild for 6 months, perhaps a year. After that, I have no confidence. Yamamoto had been optimistic. Japan had run wild for exactly 6 months, until Midway. Then the tide had turned. Then the Essex carriers began arriving. 1 every 6 weeks. Regular. Predictable. Unstoppable. The war ended in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Officer Nakamura burned his charts and photographs. There was no point keeping them. The numbers had told the story from the beginning. America's industrial capacity was too great. their shipyards too efficient, their resources too vast. Lieutenant Saito survived the war. He visited the Naval Museum years later and saw a photograph of carrier Zuikaku. She looked proud and powerful in the image, taken in 1941. He remembered her final moments, capsizing with empty decks. He remembered all the carriers Japan lost: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Taiho, and so many others. Great ships destroyed by an enemy who could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The museum had an American section too. It showed photographs of Essex-class carriers. 24 of them had been commissioned during the war. The plaques explained how American shipyards had perfected mass production techniques, how they built these complex warships using assembly line methods, how they completed one every 6 to 8 weeks at peak production. Nakamura stood beside Saito, looking at the same photographs. Two old men who had watched their country lose a war that mathematics had already decided. "We never had a chance," Nakamura said softly. "Not after Pearl Harbor. We only bought time to lose more slowly." Saito nodded. He thought about all the young pilots who died, all the sailors who went down with their ships, all the sacrifice and courage that could not overcome simple arithmetic. Japan had counted American carriers and thought they understood war. They did not understand America. They did not understand what it meant to fight a nation that could produce a fleet carrier every 6 weeks. By the time they learned, it was too late.